Do you not know about the billionaires the billionaire men who are pushing this ideology and funding it? Are you not aware of those people?
No, tell me more.
Are you saying that doesn't happen?
No, tell me more.
You just need to... No, women across New Zealand...
What? You've got to laugh when the person who has built a grift for herself by quite literally pretending like she's being silenced refuses to answer a very simple question about a topic she brought up in the interview she agreed to. Now, we'll get to the context of that snippet in a minute, but first I just need to give a content warning for the following: transmisia, antisemitism, fascism, and white supremacy. If you like our work, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing this video on social media. Hey there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and it's time for us to take a look at Ms. Keen-Minshull's train wreck of an interview with Kim Hill on Radio New Zealand. Kellie-Jay Keen-Minshull, also known as Posy Parker, is a British anti-trans bigot, a believer in gender-critical ideology, which is a form of fascism masquerading as feminism. It's a Trojan horse, a way to sneak Nazi talking points into everyday conversation and not be called out on it. Or at least, that's how it works in principle. Turns out it's a little harder to deny your fascist beliefs when, you know, flag-waving Nazis turn up at your hate rallies to support you, as recently happened at Ms. Keen-Minshull's hate rally in Melbourne, Australia, a fact we covered in a previous video. We also cover the way Ms. Keen-Minshull and her supporters openly celebrated the brutal assault of Victoria's first Aboriginal woman senator and SA survivor, Lydia Thorpe, and how even more open Nazis turned up to support Ms. Keen-Minshull in Auckland, Aotearoa, so do give those videos a watch if you have the time. Everything we produce is fully referenced, meaning you can always check things for yourself. Speaking of checking things, that brings us rather nicely to the interview between Kim Hill and Ms. Keen-Minshull on Radio New Zealand in the days leading up to her Auckland rally. Immigration New Zealand was reconsidering Ms. Keen-Minshull's visa due to the events in Melbourne, specifically the presence of open Nazis. At the same time, the security firm she'd originally booked for her Aotearoa tour pulled out at the last minute for the same reason, forcing Ms. Keen-Minshull to look elsewhere and fork out additional money, something she would complain about during her radio appearance, blaming the apparent lies that had been spread about her.
$10,000 is a lot of money for women to spend on trying to make sure that aggressive men who call themselves women don't attack us. It's horrendous. It's just so staggering.
Why would you be worried about being attacked? What were the lies that you're suggesting was spread in Australia?
Lies about who I have connections with. And this repeatedly happens to women who speak about our
Obviously
rights.
you're referring to the Nazis, the men in black giving the Nazi salute.
Yeah, having anything to do with me. What a horrible, disgusting lie. And that's because every time women speak about our rights, men, particularly men in dresses, and
I've never seen any feminist rally be attended by Nazi men other than to oppose it. But they were supporting you.
Doesn't it make you
Why do you think they were supporting you?
They weren't supporting me at all. Why would you say that?
Because they were carrying a banner calling transgender women filthy pedos.
Okay, so why is that anything to do with women? What a terrible thing to say.
Because you are an opponent of trans women.
Except it wasn't just the actions of men. It was also the actions of women, including key speakers at Ms. Keen-Minshull's hate rally, who were spotted gleefully taking photos in front of said open Nazis, seemingly thankful for their support at the time. So let's not lie to people and pretend like none of the women Ms. Keen-Minshull gave a microphone to were celebrating the presence of open Nazis. But perhaps a little more importantly, we have the words of said Nazis telling us why they were there that day.
In this country, we have medical professionals performing double mastectomies on teenage girls. And that is a fact. If you are under 18 years of age, you can have your breast removed. But you cannot get a tattoo. You cannot buy cigarettes. But the government allows young girls to have surgery because they think they were born in the wrong gender. That is the sort of society we live in. That is the sort of society that is promoted by our own government. And we have medical professionals who are supposed to be our best and brightest, removing the breasts of teenage girls. Whatever happened to the I challenge anybody to justify that to me. Why is it acceptable for a teenage girl to have surgery to change her gender? This is in 2023. We have drag queen story now. Local councils think it's acceptable for drag queens to tell stories to preschoolers. Why is that acceptable? Well, no, it's not. We are here to protect the children. We are here to protect the women.
So they're claiming that children are being indoctrinated in schools into thinking that they're transgender, part of a grooming effort by the LGBT+ community. That's why they were carrying a banner stating "Destroy Pedo Freaks," as noted by Ms. Hill, forging a spurious link between trans women and the sexual abuse of children. Do you want to hazard a guess as to who else makes such baseless accusations on a routine basis? If you guessed Ms. Keen-Minshull, you'd be correct.
Well, what's the alternative? We either stand firm or we let more and more kids get sterilised. We get more and more kids get gaslit at schools. You know, there's no choice. Once you know what's going on, you can't go back to not knowing. You can't unsee the fact that they are gaslighting children and putting women at grave danger. It's just like these kids have no idea what they're supporting. That groomers support trans youth.
Open Nazis were parroting the lies Ms. Keen-Minshull has chosen to spread about the LGBT+ community, in particular trans people, demonizing queer folk by painting us as child predators in order to build her entire career. That is why said open Nazis were there, to support Ms. Keen-Minshull's narrative in a display of solidarity. That is why people say open Nazis turned up to support Ms. Keen-Minshull, because they did, and no amount of playing coy will change that. It's also worth noting that the clip of Ms. Keen-Minshull I just played came from her Hobart rally, which took place after the events in Melbourne. I find it incredibly telling how, in spite of being aware that open Nazis making these very same accusations was still in the public's recent memory, Ms. Keen-Minshull can't help but repeat them, because they're all she has. At a foundational level, Ms. Keen-Minshull has two arguments. One, all trans women are sexual predators, and two, LGBT+ people are brainwashing young girls into thinking that they're trans men, and that is it. It just so happens that both of these were covered with the conspiracy theories forwarded by the open Nazis in Melbourne, meaning that, without them, she quite literally has nothing. She can't take them out of circulation even for a second to let the heat die down. That's why, in spite of Ms. Hill having just pointed out the fact that said open Nazis carried a banner calling trans women paedophiles, Ms. Keen-Minshull responds by reaffirming said belief.
I think it's very, very shameful of you to suggest that women who don't want our daughters to be sharing spaces with men, who don't want our daughters in school sharing spaces with boys, who I want my 16-year-old daughter to be able to walk about this world without having to put up with men in her space. And you tell me that makes people afraid, and that's catastrophizing.
When
absolutely shameful thing to suggest.
When asked about the motive of the trans lobby, You say...
What do you think the motive is of a man in a woman's space? What do you think his motives might be?
When you were asked...
it's not good.
If you could let me finish the question. When you were asked about the motive... When you were asked about the motive of the trans lobby, you said at the extreme end, it's very dangerous people who want access to children and an entire dismantling of society. Do you think that that is not catastrophizing?
So again, she reaffirms her position that A, all trans women are men, and B, that the only reason they want access to women's spaces is to sexually assault cis women, with a particular emphasis being placed on cis girls, the exact same position held by literal Nazis. This is also a tactic reliant on painting a marginalized community as an intrinsic threat, a common theme of fascism. Part of the way Ms. Keen-Minshull does this is by engaging in open dehumanization of trans people, in this instance trans women, stripping away their humanity as she reduces them down to the penis they may or may not have, as can be seen in this section from towards the end of the interview.
I don't want penises in female spaces. I think that's quite a simple idea. 95% of men who call themselves women don't even take hormones. They don't get their penis removed. They keep their penis. So I don't want them in women's spaces. I'm surprised anyone would.
I'd just like to note that no source is given for her statistical claims, but that's largely besides the point. Let's just pause for a moment to consider what Ms. Keen-Minshull means when she says, I don't want penises in female spaces. Because the image this is designed to conjure is one of a naked trans woman walking around flashing young cis girls. Except that's not what she's talking about. Women's bathrooms have individual stalls, which, if everyone is using correctly, should mean that nobody is seeing anybody's genitals. The same goes for changing rooms in retail stores. The only time they should meet is in the area outside the changing booths or by the sinks. As for places such as refuges and rape crisis centers, nobody should be seeing anybody's genitals, and I mean nobody. A fact I state with some authority as someone who has actual lived experience inside a domestic violence refuge. But that is ultimately what Ms. Keen-Minshull is referring to. Women and girls in the same room as a fully clothed adult who may or may not have a penis. And once we acknowledge that as her standard for sharing a space with a penis, we can use that to highlight the absurdity of her position. A cis male pediatrician? God, they'll allow anyone to become a doctor and see children these days, even a penis. Does a class have a cis male teacher? That's just sick. You mean to tell me you leave 30 children in the same room as a penis? Do you take your child to see Santa down in his grotto? Don't you mean you force your child to sit on a penis, you bloody groomer? That is what she is saying, just about trans women instead of cis men. This argument, if you can even call it that, is reliant not on logic, but raw emotion. It's the very same tactic used by vapid preachers of all ideologies. By framing a topic via the uncharitable use of language to invoke a reaction in people based on disgust rather than reasoning, they effectively seek to turn people's brains off to what is actually being said. If I ask you, are you okay with children being in a room with a penis? Your answer will likely be very different to me asking, are you okay with your children being in a room with a cis man? This is even though, by Ms. Keen-Minshull's own standards, those questions are about the same scenario. By reducing trans women down to the hypothetical phallus, she puts the focus on their sexual organs rather than the person they're attached to, which implies something sinister, an implication that is completely without merit. How can I say that? Well, because trans women have always used women's spaces in the UK, where Ms. Keen-Minshull is from, and their access to said spaces was actually enshrined into law under the Equality Act of 2010. Yes, it offers provisions on excluding individual trans women from certain spaces on a case-by-case basis, but that's the same for everyone. If a cis woman is known to be a predator, which they can be by the way, I was raped by a cis woman inside a domestic violence refuge, she too can be excluded from women's spaces. This provision merely protects a group's right to exclude a specific individual, even if they have a protected characteristic. But unless that's been shown to be the case, they have access to women's spaces in the UK. The government of New Zealand's position is a little more unclear due to the language used in some of their older laws. However, when Ms. Keen-Minshull is leveraging not wanting her 16-year-old daughter to share a space with a trans woman, that's already the reality she lives in. That's the reality she has lived in her entire life, a fact that has been legally protected since said daughter was 3 or 4 years of age. And it hasn't been an issue. If it had, my god, Ms. Keen-Minshull would never shut up about it, but it hasn't, hence you can only rely on empty hypotheticals, so Ms. Hill is absolutely right in calling this out as catastrophizing. Though nothing could have prepared me for Ms. Keen-Minshull's response to this line of questioning, bringing us back round to the clip played at the start.
When you were asked about the motive of the trans lobby, you said at the extreme end, it's very dangerous people who want access to children and an entire dismantling of society. Do you think that that is not catastrophizing?
Do you not know about the billionaires the billionaire men who are pushing this ideology and funding it? Are you not aware of those people?
No, tell me more.
Are you saying that that doesn't happen?
No, tell me more.
You just need to... No, women across New Zealand, they are very, very aware that there are men in women's spaces, men in women's sports, and they are giving carte blanche access to, unfettered access to women's spaces as soon as you say that those men are part of the transgender ideology. As soon as a man basically puts on a dress, he is given unfettered access to women's spaces, including prisons, including rape crisis centres. And I just think it's absolutely preposterous if you don't think women across New Zealand are afraid of that.
Could you please tell me a little more about the billionaires funding the transgender lobby?
Well, yes, you've got Big Pharma, for example. They make a substantial amount of money out of transgenderism. I want to know why it's not important to a journalist to address the fact that there are men in women's spaces.
It's really important as a journalist for me to know more about the billionaires funding the transgender lobby. And since you raised it, I'm interested to know further details. What can you tell me?
Well, I would like to know why, as a journalist, you are prepared to be distracted by that, as opposed to...
But you mentioned it.
Say a man... I haven't finished, and I'm sure you don't think interrupting is appropriate consistently when you've invited me on your show.
No, go for it.
Say that women across New Zealand are very aware of the large-scale size of a man in comparison to a woman when they're playing games like, I don't know, rugby. Isn't that your national sport?
The reason she keeps interrupting Ms. Keen-Minshull is because her answer has absolutely nothing to do with the fucking question. Ms. Keen-Minshull throughout her conspiracy line, trying to one-up Ms. Hill, power posing over her supposed ignorance with, "Do you not know?" Something that'll lead many people to feel insecure and start tripping over themselves to move on to a different topic. But Ms. Hill is having none of it and is more than happy to respond with, "No, tell me more." And it's at that point that Ms. Keen-Minshull realizes she's made a massive error in judgment. She realizes that she's now forced to choose between either listing the names of various billionaires who are often accused of transing youth as part of a globalist conspiracy to weaken the West, or she has to attack the interviewer, making out that she doesn't know how to do her job, giving us this outburst.
And I think it's shameful for anybody, certainly national radio programmes, to suggest that we are not allowed to have those spaces.
You clearly don't understand
how any woman can do it.
You clearly don't understand the function of an interview, but putting that aside...
Ouch! That was a hell of a put down by Ms. Hill, but she is right. The function of an actual interview is alien to Ms. Keen-Minshull, who has, for the longest time, relied on being served so-called soft interviews by people she knows won't ask her any difficult questions, like the names of the billionaires she's presenting as part of some global cabal to turn youth transgender. Because the names she and her supporters, people like Helen Joyce, always bring up are Jewish billionaires, with the most common three being George Soros, John Stryker, and Jennifer Pritzker. This isn't a published book, by the way, and Helen Joyce was one of the first people rushing to comfort Ms. Keen-Minshull after her Aotearoa tour fell apart. In order to understand the severity of this, we have to go back to the Nazis of Nazi Germany. Hitler rose to power on a promise that he would put an end to degeneracy, that is, a hypothetical form of social decay among the German people he argued had been engineered by Jewish people, causing, among other things, the loss of the First World War. One particular man blamed was Jewish sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, founder of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee and World League for Sexual Reform, as well as his Institute for Sex Research in Berlin. He was one of the first sexologists to approach both gay and trans people with a compassionate outlook, advocating on our behalf and even offering both sex education and early forms of HRT on a sliding scale based on how much the client earned, with said services being free for many working class German people. He even coined the term transvestite, from which we got transsexual and later transgender. However, as already mentioned, he was in the Nazis' crosshairs, meaning that the moment they rose to power, members of the Nazi Party, including Nazi youth, raided the institute, seized its research, including that into trans people, and arrested key officials. Magnus was thankfully able to escape, yet sadly died in exile, never returning home. Said research was burnt at Nazi book burnings, providing the bulk of what was destroyed, effectively erasing everything that was known about trans people up to that point. One thing they kept a hold of, however, were the user files, allowing them to round up the Institute's clients and place them in concentration camps under the pink triangle. So when Ms. Keen-Minshull and Helen Joyce forward trans people as the result of some globalist conspiracy by a Jewish elite to sterilize white girls, they are not merely making similar arguments, they are quite literally plagiarizing Hitler. Kellie-Jay Keen-Minshull is a Hitler plagiarist. But that's why Ms. Keen-Minshull refuses to name names. Ms. Hill is clearly aware of the context surrounding all this, hence she got here via discussions on the transgender lobby and anti-Semitic dog whistle. Ms. Keen-Minshull realized that, and so she has to hard pivot to sports in a desperate bid to change the conversation without appearing weak, acting as if Ms. Hill was the one to bring up Jewish billionaires in the first place. Though Ms. Hill wasn't done with her, pressing the point on Ms. Keen-Minshull's far-right supporters.
Why do you think that a lot of your support comes from the extreme right wing?
That's a disgusting question.
Oh, I don't think there are any disgusting questions. I'm keen to know the answer, though.
Why are you asking me a question and not let me finish? That is a preposterous thing to say. The majority of my support, I don't think men who believe in the far right, who call themselves Nazis, give an absolute stuff for women's rights. That's a preposterous thing to say, and a really nasty thing to say, actually.
The only problem is, you don't care about protecting women's rights. Protecting women's rights is just an easy lie you tell to pretend like your hate campaign is something more than it actually is. Furthermore, it's not a lie you're alone in making, as can be seen here.
We are here to protect the children. We are here to protect the women.
Saying that you're fighting to protect women, including women's rights, is a very cheap and easy thing to say, but it doesn't line up with Ms. Keen-Minshull's actions. For example, Ms. Keen-Minshull is infamous for telling armed men to enter women's bathrooms in order to threaten anyone who they think is a transgender woman.
Had a bit of an idea about some of the things that you can do. And men, for once, I'm talking to you. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't. Maybe you consider yourself a protector of women. Maybe you're that sort of man. Maybe you have a daughter or a mother or a wife. Maybe you have a sister. Maybe you just have some friends. Maybe you just think women are human and you don't need any absolute connection with them to feel compelled to protect us. I think you should start using women's toilets, men, because you have every right to self-identify. Clearly don't do it and upset women and girls that are already in there, but just make a point of doing it and maybe make the women feel okay about you doing it if you come out and you frighten someone. But it's about time that you started using women's toilets and saying that you identify as a woman if stopped. And I think that's how you're going to have to, that's one of the many ways that you are going to have to combat the insanity of self-ID. Even if it's not called self-ID, that's pretty much what you have now in the United States. And that's how you men are going to help. And there's going to be no excuses. And you either care about the women and girls in your life or you don't. But you are going to start inserting yourselves into spaces that are specifically for women and girls. Maybe you're going to do it when you go to your kids' school and they've had to inject this federal nonsense of accepting boys into girls' spaces. Maybe you need to make a point of saying to the head teacher that you're going to go and use the toilet and ask where the girls' toilets are. And you're going to make this really embarrassing for everybody who's going along with it. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't.
Only problem is, as the tomato juice bandit showed us in Auckland, anti-trans bigots can't tell who is and is not transgender. This has led to countless cis women who don't adhere to archaic gender norms, particularly marginalized people such as lesbians who are more likely to belong to counterculture groups, to be targeted and even assaulted by cis people who think they are trans, a phenomenon that was already well documented by the mid-2010s. And now Ms. Keen-Minshull wants to introduce firearms into those very same situations. What could possibly go wrong? This would ultimately force cis women to adhere to archaic gender norms at risk of being shot by Ms. Keen-Minshull's supporters, which is what she wants. She wants to force women to adhere to archaic gender norms, with a few privileged white women, herself included, being given special privileges under a fascist system. Another place we see her anti-woman ideology seep through is in her attack on Gillick competence, a UK standard originally created to give teenage girls medical autonomy pertaining to birth control, so long as they showed a comprehensive understanding of its side effects.
So, I'm particularly unhappy about that ruling. However, there are other routes to win this. So, my idea from now on is that maybe we need to repeal Gillick, or we need to re-examine. I just think Gillick is a law that was made for a really good reason. It was to stop pregnancy. So it was to stop quite a catastrophic, massive thing, bringing another life into the world is not something that should have ever been allowed to be used anywhere else at all. And maybe it was the first step in dividing children from their families. I don't know. I don't know actually if all said and done, whether it's really a good thing. I don't know whose benefit, what other people have benefited from Gillick, but I'm just not comfortable with it. I think it really has been used badly here. Maybe it was always going to. Maybe that was, the thin end of the wedge. There's always a thin end of the wedge. There's always an unintended consequence. Maybe this is that. We have decided that children really can consent. And I don't think they can. And I think actually we need to find other ways to stop teenage pregnancy.
Notice how, in spite of starting off by stating she believes Gillick was created for good reasons, Ms. Keen-Minshull spends the rest of her time contradicting herself, concluding by telling us very bluntly that she doesn't believe someone under the age of 16 can ever consent to medical treatment, regardless of whether they understand or not. So the very thing that is Gillick competence. This all feeds back to her fascist beliefs, in which she believes a Jewish world order is weakening the white Western world by convincing them that they are trans and sterilizing who, in her mind, are gullible white girls. Read trans men and AFAB MB folk. It's not a coincidence that many of the people Ms. Keen-Minshull surrounds herself with promote the Great Replacement conspiracy. This idea that ethnic minorities will outbreed white people, a conspiracy promoted by UK neo-Nazi Stephen Christopher Yatesy Lennon, better known as Tommy Robinson, a man Ms. Keen-Minshull is known to idolize. The natural conclusion of this racist conspiracy is the belief that it is the duty of every white woman and girl to have as many babies as possible to ensure that never happens, and naturally, attacking birth control is a key component of that. Remove a girl's ability to decide when and if she wants to have a baby, and you increase the likelihood of her becoming a mother. That's why Ms. Keen-Minshull was trying to float the idea of repealing Gillick, claiming that it was about stopping trans people, whilst also slipping in the fascist idea that birth control has resulted in broken or divided families. We also have this gross overstepping of boundaries in how Ms. Keen-Minshull fronts herself, a white woman from the UK, as an authority for Aotearoan women in her interview with Ms. Hill.
I don't want men in women's spaces, and when women speak up against men in women's spaces, these are the sorts of things that happen to women. We get tarred with just horrendous ideologies. Women across New Zealand are very, very afraid. We just had Sebastian.
Women across New Zealand are not, I put it to you, very, very afraid. The people who are afraid in New Zealand is the people who object to your catastrophizing for the sake of your own self-aggrandizement.
Are you saying that
like, she cannot fathom a power structure where she's not at the top, dictating the lives of other women, deciding what they should do, right down to their own bodies. That is why she upholds a fascist ideology, the gender-critical ideology, because she sees it as her way to secure a position at the top. Ms. Keen-Minshull believes she'll be rewarded for her years of normalizing anti-Semitism, transphobia and misogyny to the general public, all whilst pretending to fight on behalf of women. That's why, when Ms. Hill states she's never seen a feminist rally be attended by Nazi men in the following exchange...
Yeah, having anything to do with me. What a horrible, disgusting lie. And that's because every time women speak about our rights, men, particularly men in dresses, and
I've never seen any feminist rally be attended by Nazi men other than to oppose it. But they were supporting you.
Doesn't it make you
Why
feel
do you
afraid?
think they were supporting you?
Ms. Keen-Minshull doesn't correct Ms. Hill's use of feminist rally. In fact, she answers with an affirmative, I know, to assert that she was holding a feminist rally, and thus to say open Nazis were supporting her is patently ridiculous. She is very clearly attempting to paint herself as a feminist in that moment, which is interesting when we consider how her message changes once she's on the ground, surrounded by her group of stormtroopers.
I'm not a feminist. I'm not a feminist.
This goes to illustrate how Ms. Keen-Minshull changes her story depending on the environment. If she's talking on a public forum, such as Radio New Zealand, she presents herself as a feminist warrior fighting for the rights of women. Yet the moment she's on the ground, surrounded by fewer people, suddenly the masquerade drops and she very quickly rejects the label, which is almost certainly frowned upon by her fascist supporters. Ms. Keen-Minshull is only a feminist if and when it best suits her fascist goals, just like the Nazis of Nazi Germany presented themselves as having some socialist ideals to worker unions in their earlier days, only for them to destroy the worker unions once they rose to power. This is quite literally Fascism 101, and, just like her anti-Semitic conspiracies, should be setting off alarm bells in anyone who is actually paying attention. Thankfully, Ms. Hill saw right through her facade and kept pressing Ms. Keen-Minshull on her far-right connections, humiliating her in spectacular fashion by doing nothing more than asking very simple questions. Which really shouldn't be some big thing I have to celebrate, this should be par for the course, but sadly isn't. In a just world, this would be boringly typical, but in the world we've got, it's a relative breath of fresh air, and I just wanted to share it with you. If you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Gert Van Voorst, Hannah Banghart, Marble Wings, Sosh Daniels, Flynn, and Higgins the Seagull. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.